Book of the day is England Invaded by Michael Moorcock, who is called a poet of science fiction on this cover. It's a great cover, isn't it? Look at that little fallen empire and dragon. Quite beautiful, and it is a wraparound in poor condition. Not in as... It wasn't as in poor condition until after I'd read it at the beach a few times, mind you. So that's probably mostly on me. Okay, it's a Star publication, which is not a publication that I'm terribly familiar with. I can't tell where that's from originally. Oh, Allen and Co. I don't know what that is either. English book, anyway. Now, I bought this in a fairly big lot. And one of the reasons I bought this in that fairly big lot was because there were a lot of Michael Moorcock in that shop. I feel like I should be reading more Michael Moorcock. I haven't for years, and I want to get back into it. And when I first picked up this book, I was mostly interested in the cover and the fact that the back says "Future Shock from the Past," the 20th century jackboots in Whitehall, the eve of destruction, or the dawn of paradise, all the rest of it. And I was in a hurry and I didn't look at it too closely. When I got it home, I was a little bit sad to find out that it was one of a series. And then one day I picked it off the bookshelf and I thought, hey, I'll have a look at it. I picked it up, I was reading it, I was instantly invested, and I couldn't put it down. Loved the writing, really enjoyed it, and this is embarrassing, but it wasn't until the second chapter, once again, I realised that I was reading a short story collection. It is edited by Michael Moorcock, not written by Michael Moorcock. The introduction is, but the introduction really doesn't give very much about it away, so anyway. However, I'm very pleased. I'm following my goal of reading more early science fiction short stories, because short stories are where it all started. These are all really old short stories. So 1900, I think, is the average first publication. They were all first published in magazines. The volume does a very good job of attributing them. And it is quite fascinating to see how much high-quality science fiction was being produced in the 1899 and 1909, etc. by a range of authors that I don't think I'd heard of a single one. So, the first one is called The Uses of Advertisement, an Aeroplane Adventure by Tristram Crutchley from Pearson's Magazine, July 1909. And it charmed me. That's the one that totally and utterly sucked me in so that I couldn't stop reading. The writing was marvellous, the story was imaginative and delightful, and when I first read it I thought, wow, Michael Moorcock is such an amazing author. He's doing such a good job of convincing the reader that he's never actually seen an aeroplane. It's great. Then it hit me, anyway. So, the second one is called When the New Zealander Comes by Blade Muddersnook. Is that a real name? Can anyone really be called Blade or Blide Muddersnook? Anyway, it's from the Strand Magazine, September 1911. And this is a great story. So it's set in the far future. I think it's about 50,000 or so. England has fallen, civilization as we know it has fallen, Europe as we know it doesn't exist. Man has expanded to Mars and the Moon and all sorts of other places, but his great centre of modern civilization is New Zealand, and a expedition from New Zealand comes to do archaeology in London. It is very humorous. It's got some very pointed commentary, especially about England's habit of plundering the whole world, as the British Empire has been rather notorious for doing. But again, beautifully written. Number 3 was The Monster of Lake Lametri. I'll go with Lametri, by Walden Allen Curtis, and that was published in Pearson's Magazine in September 1899. This one was marvellous. I started this last year, by the way, in November, probably, and I've only just finished it now. So the Monster of Lake Lemaitre was a short story, and it's by an American writer. It is charming and funny, and it's got a very pellucidous sort of a theme. So our main protagonist, it's told in a diary form. Our main protagonist is one of the common man scientists that were very common in the 1800s and early 1900s. And he embarks on an expedition to this far remote lake from which he has heard stories that it has these incredible tidal rises and sets, and that when these tidal things happen, you find all these bony fishes with exoskeletons and ferns that haven't existed on the outside Earth for hundreds of thousands of years. So all this flora and fauna and this scientific expedition and this beautifully written adventure narrative style, really enjoyed it. So he reaches the lake, and his travelling partner is suffering from one of the many lurgies that people suffered from in the 1800s that have no modern equivalent. And our protagonist is walking on the side of the lake one day when the ridiculous happens, and he finds an elasmosaurus washed up on the beach. So for some reason that I can't remember right now, he hacks off the beast's skull. Oh no, he accidentally hacks off the beast's skull, but then lifts the top of the cranium off and sees the brain beating in it. He takes up out the brain for dissection investigation. But when he comes back later, he finds out that the animal seems to be living just fine without a brain, and it's even regenerating. So there's all these commentaries that to a modern reader seem a bit ludicrous, but they're very funny and very enjoyable to read. And then the entirely ridiculous happens. The narrator's companion walks down to the shore with him and rhapsodizes about how wonderful it would be to live in such a healthy, vigorous body. And then falls dead. So what does our narrator do? He pops the brain out of his mate's skull, pops it into the Elasmosaurus' skull, and off we go. We've got a man living inside an Elasmosaurus. It is so funny and so dated. The guy's quoted as saying, brain transplant which the medical fraternity has been predicting for some time. Anyway, it was charming. I loved the writing style. I was charmed by the attempts at bioscience and the whole notion. It's got a funny ending as well. Attempts to communicate with a man's brain grafted into an Elasmosaurus skull. That's fun too. Anyway, the next one is The Abduction by Alexandra Sane by Fred C. Small from the Harmsworth magazine, November 1900. And that's a rather neat little story. It's got a very steampunk feel to it because it is very 1900s in terms of people, discussions, demeanour and so forth. On the other hand, there's all this wild and unexplained and unexpected devices. There's devices everywhere. Fred C. Small must have been in the science fiction purely so that he could invent any sort of imaginative device inside his head and then write about it without bothering to explain how it might come about. So I've got these flying airships that everyone has, like we today have cars. You've got these imaginative notions about how photography and cinematography can be recorded, processed, developed with the use of an antigraph. And food can be summoned from the wall by the pressing buttons, a la Star Trek. We've got people who can use some sort of weird telepathic communication device which can communicate instantly telepathically between England and Japan. But one of our main protagonists has installed two in his house in Japan, one upstairs and one downstairs, because over long distances narrowing in on the mathematical triangulation can be difficult. Anyway, oh yes, these flying devices can fly between England and Japan in about 6 hours, which is quaint and would be very convenient, I've got to say. So we've got a missing beautiful damsel in distress. We've got the mate from Japan who comes to England to beg the assistance of this photographer because he knows everyone and can go everywhere. So they hop into his flying device to go off to rescue the damsel in distress, who ends up being the long lost daughter of the second protagonist. It's a very satisfying little adventure. It feels very steampunk, only better, because generally I don't much like steampunk. This I enjoyed very much. Next, you've got this very short little discourse. It's less of a story. It's more of the sort of essay that you would read in a scientific magazine. I'm not sure if the person who wrote it thought they were writing something real. I feel they may have. I feel this may have been an early attempt to warn the future about ecological devastation on a scale that we're seeing today, but it hit the mark in a few ways. Anyway, Is the End of the World Near by John Munro was published in apparently Cassels, whatever that is, in January 1899. Now, the hypothesis behind this one has got some very generic but well thought out, I expect, calculations of how much oxygen is on Earth, how much has been tied up in carbon in fossil fuels. They don't call them fossil fuels, I did. And since oxygen is required to burn both fossil fuels and non-fossil fuels, you've got this mathematical debate on how much oxygen can be used to do all that, how much oxygen and carbon is going to be released, and is this going to cause the end of the world? Now, John Munro seems to be suggesting that it would. A lot of his calculations, I think, are real, and I think a couple of the quotations and attributions of information are real as well. Anyhow, maths and physics are not my strongest points, and it made my head spin. But kudos to someone in 1899 who's already trying to calculate what the oxygen situation will look at of increasing numbers of people on Earth all burning stuff. So the fact that it's wrong on several points, like the fact that he doesn't seem to be aware that the ocean actually produces oxygen itself. So, yeah, anyway, really interesting. Anyone who's into dystopian themes and end-of-world predictions, I think should definitely try to look for Is the End of the World Near by John Munro. Now, fully half of this volume is one particular story called When William Came by H. Munro, or in brackets, Saki. Actually, more than half. All those other stories were this. One remaining story was this. So, When William Came seemed to me to be a really obscure title for some time. I think I finally got it in the end, but it took us a while. Saki was the pen name for H. Munro, who was Hector Hugh Munro, a British writer known apparently for satirising the Edwardian culture, but also the Victorian culture. And while he did write science fiction, apparently he wrote a lot of macabre stuff as well. Wikipedia tells me that he is considered by some English teachers and scholars a master of the short story, and this was a great short story. It was really, really good. Alternative universe to the max, because this was published just before World War One. And I'm guessing that at the time when he was writing this, there was already a fair bit of dread over Germany's military organisation, which prompted this, which was published in 1913 originally, and it's being at the time set a few years into what was their future, though thoroughly out past. So there was a war between Germany and Great Britain. It was definitely not a world war, it was just between Germany and Great Britain. There were apparently some trade issues, and next thing you know, Germany invaded Great Britain and did it fast and did it very, very successfully. Germany won. It's made England into a vassal state, essentially. It's now part of the German Empire. All notices are in English and German. A large number of people fled at that point, and including the king, I don't know which king. He's very subtle about not mentioning which king, who has now set up an expatriate court in India. Very little mention of South Africa and Australia, which I would have thought, even in 1913, would have been something worth mentioning. Canada is mentioned in passing, America not so much. So we mostly see this world through the eyes of Murray Yeovil, an Englishman, a wealthy upper-class Englishman by all accounts. He was overseas travelling through Russia, which he liked to do, but he was suffering from a fever when the event occurred and didn't even know about it when it was occurring. He was stuck in small huts in the Russian outback, whatever they call their outback, for a while, and then he was recuperating in a Finnish hospital. He was overseas, he didn't have another Englishman around him. And he comes home to England, where the German occupation is a fait accompli. There's nothing, no one is really fighting it in any way. It's just something that's happened and everyone's getting on with life. He also comes back to England, to the first character we meet, who is his wife Cecily Yeovil, and she is busily acclimatizing her social life in London to the occupation. So we start off with Cecily and her little protege, who's some beautiful young man with green eyes who's actually a musician. And we see far more about her social landscape and the people she knows and what they're doing in life and the next biggest thing and the next drawing room party. We see much more of that than we actually see of England being occupied by Germany. Cecily doesn't really care. She's just decided that her place in society is all she cares about, and she's getting on with that. So I feel that When William Came is far more a satire about fashionable society in Edwardian times than anything else. It would probably have hit really, really hard to anyone living in England when it was published, because he mentions all these fascinating places like the park and clubs. Men's clubs apparently mostly went extinct or moved overseas. He mentions all these tumultuous changes that were so big for Murray coming home to England and feeling out of step with the country, and they just sound historical and fascinating to the modern reader because they're obviously still not there. Anyway, it was a great story. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. Definitely alternative timeline, past, future. Just imagine what the modern timeline of that world would have been 2024. That would be wild. Anyway, beautifully written. Thoroughly enjoyed reading it. Would definitely read more by Saki, a name that I actually think I've got somewhere in my bookshelf, though I haven't visited it recently. Now, it's about short story collections. First of all, I'm really glad I finished this one. My goal of reading more short story collections from early science fiction and fantasy in 2025 seems to be off to a cracking start. I've already read 2, 3 if you include Purveyne, and I'm not sure if Purveyne really is a novel or short story collection. Anyway, short story collections. Normally, really, really hard to rate, because in any given collection, normally you've got a few that you really loved, a couple you perhaps couldn't stand at all, and most of them are in between. This, however, is the exception. So kudos to Moorcock. He's done a marvellous job of collecting stories that are beautifully, exquisitely written and very, very well matched. Because even though all of these are old, the writing makes up for any gap. The fact that they are set in the past, but of past that never happened, makes them feel strangely contemporary. And there's nothing to choose between in them in terms of writing, planning, plotting, narrative, in some cases conversation. They are all beautiful stories, and I will give this collection 4 out of 5 stars. And when I reread it, one of those things, it might well creep up to 5. It's very rare to find a volume where all the stories are so beautifully matched in terms of reading experience. So, thank you very much for watching. It is the end of February. May your March be a wonderful March full of reading, and read good books.